There is a skull in Nigeria that should not exist. It was pulled from a rock shelter called Iwo Eleru in 1965, and when scientists finally measured it carefully, they found something that broke every rule they thought they understood. The skull was old, but not old enough. It was shaped like the head of an archaic human, a primitive form that was supposed to have died out hundreds of thousands of years ago. Yet this individual had lived only around 13,000 years ago, walking the earth at the same time as fully modern people in the same region, with a head that belonged to a far older world. For decades, no one could explain it. It was too strange to fit the textbook, so it sat at the edge of the science, an awkward outlier nobody wanted to build a theory around. And then, in 2020, two researchers at a university in California found the answer to that skull's mystery without ever touching it. They found it hidden inside the DNA of living West Africans. Because the bodies of millions of people alive today carry the genetic fingerprint of a human species that left behind no skull, no skeleton, no fossil, no name, a ghost. So how does an entire kind of human vanish so completely that the only proof they ever lived is written inside the cells of their descendants? And why did the official story of where we come from have no room for them at all? This is not a story about one mysterious skull. It is a story about the most famous narrative in all of human science, the story of where our species began, and about a quiet flaw in that story that was carried for generations until the evidence buried in African genomes forced it open. For most of the last half-century, the origin of modern humans was taught as a clean and elegant tale. It is called Out of Africa. The idea is that our species arose in one place, in Africa, perhaps 200,000 years ago, a single population of anatomically modern people. From there, a small band wandered out across the world, and everyone alive today descends from that founding group. It was simple, it was powerful, it united all of humanity under one African origin, and in its broad shape, it is true. We did come from Africa, but the simple version carried a hidden assumption, the idea that within Africa itself, the story was already finished, that modern humans emerged cleanly and replaced everything that came before. The skull from Iwo Eleru whispered that this was wrong, and the DNA of living West Africans would eventually prove it. So who decided the African chapter of our origin was a solved and settled thing, and why was the evidence against it so easy to ignore? To understand what was missing, we have to begin with the individual whose bones started the unease, even though we will never know their name. We know them only as Iwo Eleru, after the rock shelter in southwestern Nigeria where they were found. In 1965, the British archaeologist Thurston Shaw and his team were excavating that shelter when they uncovered a human burial laid in a shallow grave among later Stone Age tools. This is our ancient witness, a person who lived in West Africa at the very end of the Ice Age, surrounded by the toolkit of modern human culture. The body was carefully recovered, encased in plaster, the skull prepared separately, and for years it was treated as an ordinary, if rare, ancient African. West Africa almost never yields human fossils. The hot, wet, acidic soils of the region devour bone before it can fossilize, so any skeleton at all was precious. But the precious skull held a contradiction that would not go away. When the young researcher Chris Stringer, who would later become one of the most important figures in human origin science, included the Iwo Eleru skull in his analysis in the 1970s, he noticed it was strange. Its shape was long and low, more like the skulls of much older, more archaic humans than like the rounded heads of recent West Africans. It sat apart from everyone. The question hung there for decades. How could a person with such an ancient-looking head have lived so recently? That question waited almost half a century for a proper answer. It came in 2011, when Stringer, now a senior scientist, joined the paleoanthropologist Katerina Harvati and a team to re-examine the skull with modern tools. They ran a detailed three-dimensional analysis of its shape, mapping it against a huge sample of both archaic and modern human skulls, and they redated it using uranium series methods. The results were unsettling on both counts. The dating confirmed the skull was indeed young, somewhere between roughly 12 and 16,000 years old, far too recent for an archaic human. And the shape analysis confirmed it really did cluster with much older, late archaic forms, not with the modern people who should have been its neighbors. The team's conclusion was carefully worded, but its meaning was enormous. They wrote that their findings supported the idea of deep population structure in Africa and a far more complex evolutionary process for the origin of modern humans than the clean story allowed. In plainer words, something archaic had survived in West Africa, late alongside modern humans and possibly mixed with them. But here was the wall they hit. They had a strange skull, and only one of it. They had no other fossils, no DNA, nothing to compare it to. The trail seemed to end at a single mysterious head. So if the bones could take the question no further, where could the answer possibly come from? Until now, this looks like nothing more than the ordinary slowness of science. A puzzling fossil, not enough evidence, a question left open. That is honest. You cannot build a new chapter of human history on a single skull. But then the record changes, because the deeper problem was never just a shortage of fossils. The deeper problem was that the entire discipline of human origins had been built to depend on fossils and on ancient DNA pulled from them, and West Africa offered almost none of either. The soil destroyed the bones, and so the framework, without anyone deciding it on purpose, came to treat West Africa as a kind of blank space, a region where, because nothing was preserved, it was assumed nothing complicated had happened. The absence of evidence quietly became evidence of absence. And the clean out of Africa story filled the silence with the simplest possible assumption that modern humans there had emerged and replaced everything, with no messy mixing because no bones survived to say otherwise. Consider how this worked in practice and who it served. The great triumphs of ancient DNA, the sequencing of the Neanderthal genome, the discovery of the Denisovans, all depended on one thing: cold. The fossils that gave up their DNA came from caves in Europe and Siberia, where freezing temperatures preserved the fragile molecules for tens of thousands of years. The science was, by the nature of its own method, pulled toward the cold north. The story of human mixing with archaic species was written first and loudest in Europeans and Asians, because those were the bodies the surviving DNA could be read from. Africa, the actual cradle, the place where the deepest and most diverse human history of all unfolded, was the hardest place to study precisely because it was warm. The result was a strange inversion. The continent where humanity began became, in the genetic story of archaic mixing, the quietest chapter. Not because less happened there, because less survived to be found. The framework was not maintained by a conspiracy. It was maintained by the limits of a method, repeated until those limits looked like the shape of the truth itself. The Iwo Eleru skull was an alarm bell. But an alarm bell that no one had the tools to answer was easy to file away. So who finally built a way to hear the alarm, and what did they hear? The breakthrough came from two people who decided they did not need a fossil at all. Their names are Sriram Sankararaman, a professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, with expertise spanning computer science, human genetics, and computational medicine, and Arun Durvasula, a graduate student in his lab. This is our modern witness, Sankararaman had spent years tracing the segments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA inside living people, work that normally required a reference, an actual sequenced genome from the archaic species to compare against. But for the ghost they suspected was hiding in Africa, no such reference existed. There were no bones to sequence. So Durvasula and Sankararaman did something different. They developed new statistical methods, powered by machine learning, that could detect the presence of archaic ancestry without any reference genome at all. The method looked for telltale patterns in the living human genome itself, stretches of DNA that were too different, too divergent, to have come from the known human family, segments that betrayed an ancient and very distant source. They turned this tool onto the genomes of 405 West Africans, drawn from public data in the International 1000 Genomes Project, including the Yoruba of Nigeria and the Mende of Sierra Leone. And the patterns lit up. So what exactly had been hiding in that DNA, and how much of it was there? The answer, published in the journal Science Advances in February 2020, is the finding that breaks the clean story for good. Durvasula and Sankararaman found that these West African populations carried a substantial amount of DNA from an unknown archaic hominin, a species that had split away from the line leading to both modern humans and Neanderthals before Neanderthals and modern humans themselves had separated. In other words, this ghost branched off deep before the famous fork in the family tree, and then, much later, came back and mixed with the ancestors of modern West Africans. The amount was not a trace. Depending on the population and the analysis, this ghost ancestry made up somewhere between 2 and 19% of their genomes, with a central estimate of roughly 8%. Let that settle. As much as a fifth of the genetic ancestry of some living West Africans may come from a human species that science has never seen, never named, never held in its hands as a single bone. And Sankararaman put the meaning of it plainly. He said they did not need reference DNA from any fossil to know that somewhere deep in our ancestry, humans had mixed with this population. They could now see those events simply by looking at our own DNA. The ghost left no skeleton. It left itself, written across the chromosomes of its descendants. So here is the proof, laid out plainly, the moment the simple story can no longer stand. For half a century, the cleanest version of human origins held that modern humans arose in Africa and spread out, with the real drama of mixing with other human species happening only later, outside the continent, with Neanderthals and Denisovans. The Iwo Eleru skull showed that something archaic had survived in West Africa until astonishingly recently, far too late for the clean replacement story. The destruction of bone in West African soil explained why we had almost no fossils to investigate it, and why the framework had treated the region as an empty chapter. And the 2020 genome study delivered the thing the bones never could. It showed, through the DNA of 405 living people, that a deeply divergent ghost species had mixed into the West African line and still accounts for a significant share of their ancestry today. Crucially, this was not read from a fossil because there is no fossil. It was recovered by a reference-free statistical method, peer-reviewed and published, that found the archaic signal in modern blood. The skull that science could not explain for 50 years was the visible echo of a population the DNA could finally hear. The story of a clean African origin did not survive contact with African genomes themselves. Now look back at that strange skull from the Nigerian rock shelter, the one we began with. For decades it was an embarrassment, an outlier too odd to fit, set aside because the framework had no place for an archaic head on a recent body. It was never wrong. It was simply early, a piece of evidence pointing at a truth that science did not yet have the tools to confirm. And that is the deeper lesson, the one that outlasts any single skull or study. The history of our own origins was not lost because anyone destroyed it. It was edited by an assumption, a clean and beautiful story laid over a far messier past, allowed to stand because the evidence that contradicted it was the hardest evidence in the world to find. The bones dissolved in the warm earth. The fossils were never preserved. And so a whole population of human ancestors became a ghost, not because they were unimportant, but because the soil that should have remembered them forgot. The past was not gone. It was unrecorded until a new kind of science learned to read it where it had been hiding all along, inside us. And once you understand that an entire species of human can be erased from the official story while still living in the genomes of millions, you begin to wonder how much of the human past is still waiting, not in the ground, but in the quiet code we carry without ever knowing it is there. Once you see this pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. Subscribe to History Rewritten because the past is not gone, it is edited.